Okay, so this is a new short story that I've just finished the first draft of. Um, so how it is now is not how it's going to be when it's completed, when it's finally done. But I still thought it was interesting enough to do a reading of it. Hope you all enjoy. Actually, today is my daughter's 13th birthday, so happy birthday, Sela. And kind of ties into this story a little bit, actually. It's a father obsessed. Hopefully, I'm not a father obsessed, but uh, father daughter relationships. I guess it's similarities. I tried to do a reading of this earlier today, but it was on my phone, and my phone decided, well, the app decided it was just going to crap out and it just crashed when I was about halfway through. So I had to start all the way over. But I would love for you all to give me any feedback. Anyone who's listening, just let me know what you thought in the comment section. Subscribe. I'm probably going to start doing this on at least a semi-regular basis. Here we go. The ride down. Are you going out in that? Roger asked his daughter. He'd barely looked up from his paper this morning or from the television now, but now his only child was all he could look at. Dad, I can't do this with you now, Alyssa said. I told you a week ago Tyler and I were going to the concert tonight. He's already bought the tickets. Double, double, he began, trying to recall the name of the band she told him. In truth, he couldn't get past her outfit. He knew his little girl wasn't so little anymore, but the way the flimsy amount of material of her skirt squeezed her, how much her top revealed. 666, Dad. Remember, I played you that one song? Roger remembered the song. It had kept him awake for an extra hour after he'd gone to bed that night. Roger was no fuddy-duddy. He'd been a teen once and had liked music his parents hadn't approved of. And he didn't buy into the whole Satan hysteria like his parents had in the 80s. But his daughter, his little girl, she was checking every box he had so far as things to be alarmed by. For starters, her clothes. Too much cleavage. He hadn't even known she developed that much and hoped it was from one of those miracle bras Miriam had told him about. God let her rest. Roger blanked his expression, calmly traveling his eyes up and down her outfit. She was definitely becoming a woman. There was no denying that. The boys back in his day would have said she was fat. Hell, who was he kidding? He'd been one of those boys. No doubt the jargon had changed, but the sentiment hadn't. Boys would be crawling all over her the moment they laid eyes on her. This boyfriend of hers would have both his hands beneath her clothes as soon as she was in his car if he allowed her out like she was dressed. He had to stop it. But his little girl was like a hand grenade when she didn't get what she wanted. She would explode in a temper tantrum and make life miserable for everyone around her. That was only him now that Roger Jr. was off to college and his wife had passed. God bless her. But if Miriam could see her now, knowing she was about to leave and be with her, Roger knew his name, Tyler, but he wouldn't dignify her enough to call her his girlfriend. The first time she'd mentioned him to her father, he'd just been a guy. What do you mean, a guy? Roger had asked. You mean your boyfriend? She'd had a few in school. Her first a puppy love thing in fifth grade, a summer long thing with the neighbor between eighth and ninth grade. Thankfully, he'd been gay, even Roger had seen that a mile off. And then the kicker for the football team in the 10th grade. All of them had had the title of boyfriend, not Tyler. He was just a guy. Roger hadn't known how to take that. A guy implied someone she barely knew or had met by coincidence. He could deal with her liking a guy. That more than likely meant she'd see him a time or two and then he'd be gone. A guy was forgettable, but Tyler hadn't been just a guy. He was a guy. He had almost the same anonymity as a stranger. When Roger had asked her details on the young man, she hadn't known. How old is he? What's his last name? Where's he from? What school does he go to? Where'd you meet? I don't know, his little girl had said to all his questions, save for the last one. That one she actually did have an answer to, but it had deepened the sick, sinking feeling inside him at the time. At Loco Tattoo, she'd said. It had been all he could do to not leap out of his lazy boy and peel her down to her underwear and examine her for tattoos, and she'd seen the look on his face. Relax, Daddy. I didn't get one. I was there with Sarah. Her mom let her get a tattoo. Linda's actually pretty cool. Sarah's mom was not pretty cool. Linda Collins was an unemployed drunk living off monthly alimony checks in the house that had been passed down through her husband's family for at least 3 generations. She was in desperate need of a friend and made one out of her daughter. Roger kept a mental countdown of when the girl would be single and pregnant with her own rugrat, and he was certain it would be before graduation. But he played that relationship cool. Roger knew if he blew up at his daughter and forbade her from seeing Sarah, she would just go underground with their friendship and wind up doing all kinds of things he wouldn't have approved of and wouldn't have known about until the police called. He'd encouraged as gently as possible for Alyssa to bring Sarah over here to do homework, hang out, eat pizza, or do whatever girl stuff teenagers do, and it hadn't taken too much longer for the friendship to self destruct on its own. He hadn't asked his daughter for details, simply letting her cry on his shoulder had dried her tears. He'd taken her out for ice cream, and for a couple hours it had been like he'd had his little girl back again. Roger could play it cool again. This Tyler sounded like the arrogant type, who would treat a girl like garbage and dump her once he'd had his way with her. But he didn't know Alyssa like Roger did, and she was a princess. The moment old Tyler called her babe and slapped her on the bottom or made eyes at some other girl on the street, Alyssa would walk out and right back to her dear old dad. She was around the corner from 17, and he'd have to start preparing himself for the idea of his daughter being away from him. But damn it, not now. Not yet. She was still his, and Roger wasn't about to let some leather jacket wearing punk take his child and use her. I remember the song, Roger finally said. I hated it. Sorry. Alyssa laughed and sat on the footstool in front of him. She placed a hand on his thigh. Could I have some money for the concert? She asked. Roger looked at her again. Something about the way she put her chin down and looked up at him. No, not puppy dog eyes. She knew he'd see that a mile off. Something about her face at this angle made her look like a 4-year-old. Something about that age was his favorite time. Roger put up a fight, even though he mentally was already reaching for his wallet. You're telling me this Tyler doesn't have the money to treat a lady? Daddy, she said, he bought the tickets. It's only fair that I pay for concessions. Get with the times. That stung a little. Roger considered himself a modern man. In principle, he agreed that a woman was equal to a man in every way that mattered, but his mother had raised him to open doors for a woman, to walk on the outside of the sidewalk, hold the umbrella, and pick up the check. It was hardwired into him, and despite how many odd looks he got from women in their 20s and sometimes 30s, he couldn't help opening doors or walking on the outside of the sidewalk. Oh, right, Roger said, attempting to roll with it. What time does he get here? He is picking you up, isn't he? Alyssa smiled a little too wide as Roger fished his wallet out. He took 2 20s out and placed them in the flat of her outstretched palm. When she left her hand hanging there, he took out one more 20 and reunited it with the others. Thanks, Daddy. She leapt at him, wrapping her arms around his head and crushing his wallet against his chest. Roger was briefly aware of the soft flesh of her bosom against the back of his hand. Any time, baby, he said once she'd let him go. He was about to ask what time her date was going to get here when the doorbell rang. He was about to tell his daughter that he'd get the door when she squealed and ran upstairs. I have to finish getting ready, Alyssa said before she fled. Roger was confused. She'd looked ready to him. Well, not ready to him. That would have meant a bland burlap dress with a high collar that went to her ankles. He seriously doubted she was going to put anything more on, and she had her face made up as well. As near as he could figure, it was a stalling tactic meant to show Tyler that she hadn't been waiting on him, to make him wait on her. Roger girded himself for what he figured was the worst possible situation. Some middle aged man, lousy with tattoos and piercings and a beard down to his beer gut. He was certain his daughter had better taste than that and hoped he would be somewhat relieved to see the man. Tyler was an actual shock to Roger once he'd opened the door. He was a tall, slender, handsome young man with a head full of thick black hair. He was white, and that stung a little, but as bad as it could have been, Roger could definitely let that pass. Mr. Sand, Tyler said, flashing a full, all white smile. Roger had to admit he was handsome. Tyler, Roger forced his own smile, pushing open the screen door slightly, inviting the young man inside. He stepped aside, allowing Tyler in. He smelled nice and was dressed, well, better than Alyssa. He had on cream slacks with a black and white checkered button up beneath a burgundy sports jacket. Roger shut the door and locked it, making his way back to his recliner. Have a seat, Roger gestured to the love seat adjacent to him, and Tyler nodded. She's almost ready. He'd intentionally not shaken the boy's hand. He'd obliged as much as he was going to. Tyler sat, lacing his fingers in his lap and facing him. So, sir, Alyssa tells me you're a comptroller? Huh? Roger wasn't actually expecting conversation on top of being referred to as sir. Oh, yes, yes, at Medline Diagnostics. Tyler smiled and nodded. Cool. I go to one of their patient service centers whenever I need to get my blood drawn. Roger froze with the remote poised in his hand. Was this boy actually engaging him in conversation? I actually don't go to the PSCs often. I work at the Michigan headquarters in Auburn Hills. So you have a degree in accounting then? Where from? Despite himself, Roger was starting to like the boy. He was engaging and seemed really interested in what Roger had to say. He blinked several times. OU. I actually used to be in construction, but I had to get out when I wrecked my back. Got my degree in '06. He put the remote on the end table and shifted in Tyler's direction. What about you? Are you in school? No, sir. I graduated last year and put off college. Figures. Now here comes the wreckage, Roger thought. I can go to college any time, and I figured I shouldn't waste my parents' money until I know what I want to do. So I spent about 6 months in Ghana with the volunteer service overseas. I figured if I'm not any use to myself, I may as well be of use to others. What what did you do in Ghana? Tyler laughed. Got dysentery half the time I was there. The only reason I came back when I did was because I came down with a parasite. I just finished my treatments 2 weeks ago and I'm thinking of going back. Roger realized at some point his mouth had fallen open. Hi, Tyler. Alyssa slowly walked down the stairs, and the boy stood. He dialed back his smile, and Roger watched him, watching her. Hey! They embraced. When he pulled back, Tyler looked her up and down. Roger didn't like that much, and then the boy surprised him again. Hey, it's going to be chilly tonight. I think you should put on a sweater. One thing Roger's daughter had never been was a pushover. He was prepared for her to give Tyler a piece of her mind, although Roger was conflicted. He would have preferred for her to be covered up. She looked like she'd exposed even more cleavage than before. Roger was honestly surprised she was so bountiful. Alyssa nodded. Okay, give me a minute, she said. I know just the one. She turned and dashed back upstairs. Roger was standing now too, and he approached Tyler. So, are you from around here? Tyler looked at him and shrugged. As much here as anywhere. Army brat. I was born in Germany, spent a few years in Japan, a few in North Carolina, etc., etc. Roger nodded. Despite himself, he was starting to like this boy. What time does the concert start? He asked. Oh, 9 o'clock, sir. Roger nodded. Any idea when it'll be over? Tyler shrugged again. Probably after 1, but we'll probably leave before then. If I don't get at least 5 hours sleep, I'll be dead on my feet at the soup kitchen tomorrow. Soup kitchen? Roger asked, surprised yet again. Tyler slowly looked away from the stairs and back at him. Yes, that's always been one of my first stops since I was 15, finding a place that feeds the underserved. Is this through the church you go to? Tyler laughed. I actually don't belong to a church. My grandpa was a preacher, but he fell in love with my grandma and left his wife. He kind of never looked back, and well, it was never important to my folks. I believe in God, but I find it's more important to actually do good things than just believe in them. Roger opened his mouth to say something, but then Alyssa was coming down the stairs. He found himself feeling a little disappointed their conversation was being cut short. She still had on the skirt that was entirely too high up her thigh, but there wasn't a peak of cleavage to be seen, although the sweater showed plenty of midriff. You look amazing, Tyler said. We'd better go before we get snagged by traffic. Roger felt a little rebuffed that the boy had completely lost interest in him, and he had to remind himself who Tyler was actually here for. He watched the pair for just a moment, thought they might make a cute couple. Roger was a hair's breadth from approving. A hair's breadth. Alyssa hugged and kissed him, and no sooner had Roger shook the boy's hand than Tyler turned and grabbed a handful of ass cheek, ushering Alyssa to the door. It was no more than a half second, but Roger had seen the squeeze and heard his daughter squeal as she opened the door. You two drive safe, Roger barely managed to say. He felt like he'd been kicked in the solar plexus. They stepped outside, Tyler uncomfortably close to his daughter. Roger was wavering on stepping onto the porch to watch them leave, but Alyssa turned around while they were on the walkway. Good night, Dad, she said, flashing an embarrassed smile. Go back inside. I'm coming back. Tyler never turned to look back at him, and it made Roger feel like their conversation had all been an act for Roger's sake. He'd thoroughly been disarmed, and now the boy was making off with his daughter. Before they rounded the corner, though, Roger saw a mark of some kind on the back of his neck. He squinted and was reasonably certain it was part of a tattoo. Roger went back in and locked the door. He walked into the powder room and was barely able to make out Tyler's car from a sharp angle at the window. It was some sort of classic car, maybe a Chevy. He hoped it had been retrofitted with seatbelts. The engine revved to life and the car began backing out of the driveway. He was grabbing his keys before he'd even thought about what he was about to do. Roger figured he could let them get a head start because he knew where they were going. The Brutus Arena was in the thick of redevelopment downtown. All four major sports teams were within a square mile of one another, with Ford Field and Comerica Park essentially right across the street. Roger still hadn't consciously decided to follow them when he got in his car. He slid his key in the ignition, hit the button to open the garage door, and had his seatbelt buckled before he realized he was really going to do it. Alyssa would be upset with him if she spotted him. It would probably take at least a dozen trips to the mall before she forgave him. But the thought of her with that tattooed boy, he'd been just so slick. Roger was out of the subdivision, headed toward the intersection when he spotted them 4 cars ahead. The sun was already low, and that would help him hide. They were in the left turn lane behind one other car when the Chevy's top began to retract. Roger saw red. His little girl was on the passenger side, but she was snuggled up to him, her head on his shoulder. It wasn't so much that anything inappropriate was happening, but that was always what she'd done with him when she was younger. Roger had known she should have been buckled up, but he cherished the time he'd had with his daughter, and the bench seat in his truck had made it so easy. It was like a betrayal of the time they'd had together. Rather than get in the left turn lane to follow them, he stayed where he was, going across the intersection. The light would have turned red well before he would have been able to make the turn, and he didn't want to fall too far behind. Even though they were supposed to be going to the concert at the Brute, that didn't mean Tyler wouldn't make a pit stop and try to press his luck. There were cars coming in the opposite direction, and Rogers swung right, then U turned, cutting off the lead car before getting in the right lane and turning in the direction Tyler had gone. It was a chilly spring evening, with the sun going down already, but he could still make out the pair. Traffic was light, so he should have hung back, but he couldn't help himself. He had to see what Tyler, if that even was his name, was tempting his little girl into doing. In a few miles, they were merging onto I-75, and rather than putting the top back up to protect themselves from being buffered by the wind, Tyler kept it down. Roger caught himself pulling up too close to them twice before intentionally letting a PT Cruiser between them for a good 2 miles. Tyler had begun playing in her thick mane of hair. easily one of her best features, considering she had hair just like her mother's. Roger had smelled it so many times since his Miriam, God be with her, had passed. A light drizzle began, and Roger was certain Tyler would put the top up. Alyssa was going to get soaked. He silently promised that if she woke up tomorrow with a cold, he was going to throttle Tyler. She put her hands up as if welcoming the rain, swaying her arms back and forth. She was behaving so irresponsibly. It made Roger uncomfortable to see his daughter this way. He checked their speed. He'd begun pacing them a few miles back and saw they were going 76 miles an hour. Alyssa pulled away from Tyler, finally, but she got up on her knees and hung nearly half her body out of the car. Excuse me. Roger's heart leapt. This was getting out of hand. Not only was Tyler being inappropriate with his daughter, but he was putting her in danger, too. His instinct was to pull alongside them, flag them down, and force her to come back home with him. But he knew his daughter. The tantrum she would throw would be epic. He couldn't even guess how long it would be before she would forgive him. Besides, she sat back down after a moment when Tyler seemed to be rubbing her behind. No! Roger thought as Tyler's hand slid underneath her skirt. She whirled on him, slapping his hand away. Roger resisted the urge to pump his fist in the air. That was the little girl he knew, but he could see the look on her face, and she was smiling. That couldn't have been. She couldn't have enjoyed that. Roger rolled down the window. He was getting too hot. He mopped his brow with the sleeve of his shirt as Alyssa playfully slapped at his shoulder. Tyler made some sort of gesture, and then Alyssa grabbed the steering wheel with one hand. Roger didn't understand what was happening, as the young man seemed to be doing something with his hands below the steering wheel. Roger felt a stab of panic as they came to a curve in the freeway, but Alyssa handled it seamlessly, the car not even slowing. Tyler's hands came back up, one pinching the steering wheel while the other wrapped around Alyssa's shoulders. No, not wrapping around her shoulders. He put his hand to the back of her head. Stop it, Roger said aloud. Don't do that. He was certain this was where things turned around. There was no way his little girl was going to. Gently, Tyler pushed at the thicket of her hair, and Alyssa's head disappeared into his lap. Roger thought he was going to be sick. His foot slacked from the gas pedal until he was doing 49. Cars blew past him, including a truck with a trailer that nearly blew him onto the shoulder. Roger thought he would be sick. He steeled himself and got in the center lane so he could pull alongside them. But before he could speed up, the Chevy cut him off, slicing across all three lanes and over to the 9 Mile exit. Roger was surprised, but he managed to get over in time to take the exit as well, cutting in behind a Jeep in the right lane. Where were they going? The Brute Arena was downtown, and this was Hazel Park. They weren't even in Wayne County yet. Roger's mind was set now. Tyler was now actively lying by not going straight to the arena. He wasn't even going to waste words with him. Roger was going to floor him and drag Alyssa off if need be. They stopped at the red light, coming off the freeway. Roger was surprised he was bothering to obey a traffic light. It wouldn't be safe to do it here. He'd wait until they were on 9 Mile to stop them. The light turned green and they turned right, headed toward Ferndale. Roger had to weave around one car to get behind them. There wasn't room enough for him to get next to them without his car being in the opposite traffic lane. Alyssa turned as if she were about to look over her shoulder, and he panicked. Roger didn't want them to see him until he had them stopped, but he didn't know how to do that. Perhaps by some act of divinity, smoke began to pour from the hood of the Chevy. They turned into the next lot. Roger was right on them. Maybe old Tyler wouldn't have a ride home in the next few minutes, but Roger was going to protect his daughter. They were out of the Chevy by the time he pulled in behind them, parked by an abandoned building. Roger got out of his car as he saw his daughter rounding the corner of the building with the boy, giggling. Roger grunted. Oops. Alyssa! He slammed the door and jogged after them. When he turned the corner of the building, he caught sight of what appeared to be two figures standing, well, one standing by a dumpster. As he got closer, what appeared to be a person kneeling in front of another turned out to be a trick of shadow in a close grouping of three cardboard boxes. A door at the back of the building creaked as it opened, catching his eye. Roger grabbed the handle and yanked on it. but it was locked. No, damn it, no! He kicked the door in frustration and looked around. There were three iron barred windows to his right. He went to the one with two bars already pried up. The glass blocks of all three looked like they would collapse with a good shove. He gave the bars a good pull, and they didn't budge. Then he moved to the next window, and the bars came out with barely a tug. Roger was surprised by the weight and was barely able to keep from being pulled over, straining his back in the process. Felt like a flame had licked up his lower back, and he stayed in that position for a count of 20 before he was confident he could move. Roger stood and slapped at the glass blocks in the window. They didn't budge despite how flimsy they looked. He scanned the alley for something to shatter them, and his eyes settled on a chunk of concrete a little bigger than both his fists. His back twinged in protest, and instead of bending over, he got down on one knee. For the briefest moment, proposing to Miriam, God love her, flashed through his brain, and he laughed, seeing how ridiculous this whole thing looked. But thinking of his dead wife got him back on track. He had to rescue Alyssa. Roger grunted through the pain as he stood upright. It actually didn't hurt as much as he'd been expecting, and he was able to get the chunk up to shoulder level by the time he got back to the window. Throwing it might not be enough. Roger figured he needed to get a little oomph and did a couple spins to build up centrifugal force before he launched it. The glass blocks didn't hold up beneath the chunk as it smashed into the building. Roger pushed out as many of the shards of glass as he could before climbing in. Still a shard of glass scratched down his back, but he was committed and pushed through until he fell inside. It was dark in here. Roger laid on the floor for a long moment, listening. There was something in the distance he couldn't make out. It sounded like human voices, but neither of them sounded like his little girl's. Roger slowly got to his feet, his hand coming down on something cold and metal. He carefully stepped around what he guessed was a mixer. He'd worked in a pizza restaurant in his college years, feeling his way past several more pieces of large equipment until he came to what had to have been the dining room floor of the restaurant. Somebody giggled. Roger's ears prickled. That was his Alyssa. Baby, he said before he thought about it. The voices continued. He advanced in their direction, biting his lip to keep himself quiet. Maybe he'd blown the element of surprise, and maybe he hadn't. Whoever he'd heard seemed so preoccupied with what they were doing. Maybe they hadn't heard him call out. Roger's eyes adjusted to the dark. He could make out a table just ahead of him and a row of booths to his left, but he bumped into another table, barely not falling over it and crashing to the floor. The voices were coming from somewhere to his right, and he turned his head to listen. Yes, definitely over there. He began shuffling in that direction, careful not to trip again. Roger would have to surprise them, overwhelm Tyler, and then grab Alyssa and get out of here as quickly as possible. There was only one reason why they would be in here, and Roger only hoped he could get his little girl out of here before that could happen. He was less than a dozen feet away before he realized they were in a restroom. It was such a cliche. Of all the places, they were in the clicheest of cliches for for sex. The thought alone propelled him inside. Roger was bumping against walls until he'd reached the stall before he realized he was in the wrong one. Their voices echoed overhead, and he listened for a moment. I never saw one like that before. It's okay. You can touch it. It won't hurt. Is it always that red? Your hand is so cold. Roger felt along the wall, working his way backward until he was out of the restroom. He continued moving toward the voices until it sounded like he was right on top of them. You'll go slow, right? Yeah, baby. However you want it. You stop right there, Roger shouted. He fumbled for his cell phone and turned on the flashlight app. He turned it all around the room until he spotted them just inside the stall, sitting on the floor with their legs crossed. Tyler looked up at him, his bug-like eyes not focused on anything. Alyssa kept her head down and put a hand up. Ow, she said. Turn it off. Alyssa, baby, it's time to come home. Daddy? Her voice was shocked, but he could hear the anger rising in her tone. Tyler didn't move. Come on, Roger said, holding his hand out. It's time to go. Why are you here? She asked. I told you we were going to a concert. I followed you, he said, a swelling of righteousness in his chest. You followed me? She dropped her hand, and in the near dark, he thought he saw something on her face. No, not on her face, but something was wrong with it. Roger thought for just a moment it had way too many teeth, and far larger than they should have been. He blinked several times, and Alyssa's face was like it should have been, albeit a little dirty. Daddy, go back. Get off the floor. You're coming home. No, go away. Little girl, don't make me drag you out. She'd covered her face with her hands as they yelled at each other, and he saw her hands covered with something dark. As a matter of fact, it looked like it was all over her. Alyssa slapped her palms on the tile floor and screamed, Daddy, this is my life. Roger was taken back aback a moment, his mouth working until he found words to speak. You are my child, he said with measured rage. Until you're an adult, you have no life. He was done arguing. He brushed Tyler aside and hooked Alyssa under the arm. Something about the boy hadn't felt right, but Roger was too pissed to take notice. He hauled his daughter to her feet, his back protesting, but he didn't care. He let the pain fuel his anger and gave Alyssa a shove toward the door. She whimpered as he righted her course, roughly guiding her around the tables he could see in the dark, now that his eyes had adjusted. The fight had gone out of Alyssa as they stepped outside and back into the alley. She kept sniffling and making crying sounds, further bolstering Roger's sense of indignation. They walked past Tyler's car, Roger resisting the urge to key its blood red paint job. Wait, hadn't Tyler's car been black? Roger tossed the thought aside as he opened the door for Alyssa and helped her in. He even buckled her seatbelt for her like he'd done back when she was 3. I'm so sorry, Daddy, Alyssa said once he was in the car. She turned away from him, hiding her face in shame. Roger nodded as if acknowledging to himself that he'd done the right thing. He started the car, slowly backed out of the narrow lane and back onto the street. In a minute, they were back on the freeway, headed home. For several long minutes, he didn't know what to say. He was upset, but she was his baby girl, and he had gotten to her in time, hadn't he? Roger shivered. He didn't want to think about what she could have been doing. Something niggling at the back of his brain still asked the question, what was she doing? As horrifying as the idea of some boy copying a field was, what she'd actually been up to had still been strange. There were a million places they could have gone if they were just going to make out. Roger knew of several that were still around from back in his day, and he definitely made good use of a lot. Where they'd actually gone had just been so out of the way. Had Roger not been on their tail practically the whole way, he would never have found them, and he doubted a patrol car would have either. The Chevy had been parked next to an abandoned restaurant, and on the opposite side was an overgrown hedge that would have obscured practically the whole vehicle from westbound traffic. Drugs. It had to have been drugs. Roger shook his head. He'd had his run with marijuana when he was a teen and had been offered cocaine a time or two. He tried telling himself this was normal. At least all her clothes were on when he found her. But wait a second. Roger glanced at his daughter, still resting her head against the window. She looked like she might have been asleep. He almost lost the thread of what he was thinking before he trailed his eyes down her body. From the rise of her bosom to the curved, flat plane of her stomach, she was no little girl anymore, but that wasn't it. Her clothes were different. Roger knew full well that girls sometimes left the house and changed into clothes their parents wouldn't approve of, but she was wearing a black, knee-length dress with flowers on it, with a light cardigan over that. Hell, he could barely see any cleavage at all. Why would she change into something more conservative after she left the house? And then he noticed the smell. It was thick and earthy, a bit of ash. So she probably had been smoking. He was disappointed, but it wasn't the end of the world. He could still have his baby. Roger licked his thumb and reached over to wipe a smudge of filth off her cheek. It didn't come off so much as it smeared. It felt thick and tacky as he rubbed it against his finger. Roger turned the light on and looked at his hand. It was blood. Daddy, Alyssa said. Her voice was thick and heavy. He glanced at her, and she hadn't moved save for her chest heaving up and down as she breathed. Aren't I your little girl still? Yes, baby. Roger wiped his finger and thumb on his shirt subconsciously, noticing several more dark patches on her skin and clothes. You know you are. We'll get through this, okay? Roger still hadn't turned off the dome light. He glanced at his daughter again, confused. The splotches that were obviously blood now trailed with the sweat pouring off her. You should pull over, she said. I don't want to do this while you're driving. Do what? The smell was suddenly dominating the inside of the car. Roger felt on the verge of being overwhelmed by it and rolled down all the windows despite the cool air. I don't have long. I have a curfew, Alyssa said. Roger's foot had slacked off the gas pedal and he was drifting out of his lane. A car honked him as it blasted past, and he corrected his vehicle. Baby, what are you talking about? He felt a sick feeling coursing down his spine. Was that Tyler back there? She sat up, shaking her head. I didn't ask him his name. We can do this the gentle way. You'll go to sleep. He didn't want to ask the obvious question. He didn't want to know. You're you're not my daughter, are you? The car had slowed to just under 13 miles an hour in the center lane. Cars were honking and shaking the cars they flew past. Without looking up, Alyssa reached up and grabbed the steering wheel. Roger sat paralyzed as she pulled him over onto the shoulder. He finally put his foot on the brake and stopped them. Alyssa put the car in park. Then she turned her head up at him. Your head, your face. Roger scuttled backward in his seat. He was too panicked to open his door, fumbling uselessly at the door as he stared into an open chasm inside this girl's head. From her chin to the point of her skull was simply open, and he could see veins, muscle tissue, slick and shining in the cavernous light. His daughter's voice came out of that gaping emptiness. She turned to him, the seatbelt tearing off her like a strip of paper. She laid an ice cold hand on his shoulder. You seem like a nice enough guy. I don't have to rip you apart. Just pull your pants down, and it'll be over before you know it. You might even enjoy it. The end. So, like I said, still a work in progress. I noticed a couple errors, obviously, with the first draft that hopefully I will be correcting soon. This is a story that I wrote with the intention of submitting it for an anthology. But please don't forget to like, subscribe, leave a comment. I would like to know what you thought for anybody listening right now, and hopefully we'll be doing this again soon.